Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Ghosts and Spirits video. Well, I had a lot of fun last time when it came to introducing this new book, the one called The World's Greatest Ghost, in my inaugural video. I thought I would do another one here. This one continuing with part 2 of chapter 1, the one titled Vengeful Ghosts and Curses. As you saw in the last part, there's a lot of great little mini stories associated with each chapter. So I'm going to do part 2 here, and then it pretty much wraps up the entire chapter, and then I'll give my own thoughts and opinions on it afterward. It does seem like people are interested with regards to this book and the chapters, at least based on the analytics that I just saw, and the comments are on there too as well. So why not? Want to go ahead and just continue another part here. So without further ado, this next segment is called The Mummy's Hand. So here's what it states. Count Louis Hammond was famed as an occultist and psychic healer. He was often given exotic presents by grateful clients he had cured, but the oddest gift of all brought him nothing but trouble. On a visit to Luxor in 1890, Hammond cured a prominent sheik of malaria. The sheik insisted that the healer accept a gruesome gift, the mummified right hand of a long-dead Egyptian princess. Count Hammond's wife disliked the dry, shriveled hand from the first, but her dislike turned to horror and revulsion when she heard the story behind it. In the 17th and last year of his reign, King Ananton of Egypt, the heretical father-in-law of Tutankhamun, quarreled over religious matters with his daughter, and the king's vengeance was ghastly. In 1357 BC, he had the girl raped and murdered by his priests. Afterwards, they cut off her right hand and buried it secretly in the Valley of the Kings. The people of Egypt were appalled, for the girl would be barred from paradise because her body was not intact at burial. Hammond would have turned the relic over to a museum, but could not find a curator willing to accept it, so he locked it away in an empty safe in the wall of his London home. In October 1922, he and his wife reopened the safe and stood back in horror. The murdered girl's hand had changed. Shriveled and mummified for 3,200 years, it had begun to soften with new flesh. The Countess screamed that it must be destroyed. Although he had never before been afraid of the unknown, Hammond agreed with her. He insisted on only one thing, that the hand of the princess must have the best funeral they could give it. They were ready on the night of October 31st, 1922, Halloween. In a letter to his girlfriend, the archaeologist Lord Carnarvon, Hammond wrote that he laid the hand gently in the fireplace and read aloud a passage from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. As he closed the book, there was a blast of thunder that rocked the house into total darkness. The door flew open with sudden wind. Hammond and his wife fell to the floor and lay there in the sudden glacial cold. Lifting their eyes, they saw the figure of a woman. In Hammond's account, she wore the royal apparel of old Egypt, with the serpent of the house of the pharaohs glittering on her tall headdress. The woman's right arm ended in a raw stump. The apparition bent over the fire and then was gone as suddenly as it had appeared. The severed hand had vanished with it and was never seen again. 4 days later, Hammond read the Carnarvon expedition had rediscovered Tutankhamen's tomb and that they would enter it in spite of the ancient warning emblazoned at the threshold. From the room in the hospital where he and his wife were under treatment for severe shock, Hammond sent his old friend a letter begging him to reconsider. He wrote, "I know now the ancient Egyptians had knowledge and power of which today we have no comprehension. In the name of God, I beg you to take care." Carnarvon ignored the letter, and soon afterwards he was dead from an infected mosquito bite. One by one, members of the expedition followed him to the grave in what became known as the Curse of the Pharaohs. Then there's this little segment that's called Double Exorcism. It states, two churches were in dispute over who had the right to exorcise the ghost of a nun. The ghost, seen first by two workmen building a multi-story car park at Guildford, southern England, was reputed to be the spirit of a nun murdered at that spot, once a chalk quarry hundreds of years ago. The curate of the local Roman Catholic church told worshippers, "I think the murdered nun was a Catholic. A Catholic priest should perform the rite." But the local Anglican church claimed the nun was Protestant and that an Anglican should perform the exorcism. In the end, they both did. Next segment is called Princess of Death. Egyptologist Douglas Murray neither liked nor trusted the disheveled American who sought him out in Cairo in 1910. The man had a furtive manner and appeared to be in the final stages of disease. But Murray, a refined Briton, could not resist the blandishments of his disreputable visitor, for the American was offering him the most priceless find of his career. It was the mummy case of a high princess in the temple of Amun-Ra, who was supposed to have lived in Thebes in 1600 BC. The outside of the case bore the image of the princess, exquisitely worked in enamel and gold. The case was in an excellent state of preservation. An avid collector, Murray couldn't resist. He drew a check on the Bank of England and took immediate steps to have the mummy case shipped to his London home. The check was never cashed. The American died that evening. Murray learned from another Egyptologist in Cairo why the price had been so reasonable. The princess from Amun-Ra had held high office in the powerful cult of the dead, which had turned the fertile valley of the Nile into a place only of death. Inscribed on the walls of her death chamber, she had left a legacy of misfortune and terror for anybody who despoiled her resting place. Murray scoffed at the superstition until 3 days later. That was when he went on a shooting expedition up in the Nile, and the gun he was carrying exploded mysteriously in his hand. After weeks of agony in the hospital, his arm had to be amputated above the elbow. On the return voyage to England, 2 of Murray's friends died from unknown causes. 2 Egyptian servants who had handled the mummy case also died within a year. Back in London, Murray found the mummy case had arrived. When he looked at it, the carved face of the princess seemed to come alive with a stare that chilled the blood. Although he had made up his mind to get rid of it, a woman friend convinced him that he should give it to her. Within weeks, the woman's mother died, her lover deserted her, and she was stricken with an undiagnosed wasting disease. When she instructed her lawyer to make her will, he insisted on returning the mummy case to Douglas Murray. By now, a broken wreck of a man, Murray wanted no part of it. He presented it to the British Museum, but even in that cold and scientific institution, the mummy case was to become notorious. A photographer who took pictures of it immediately dropped dead. An Egyptologist in charge of the exhibit was also found dead in his bed. Disturbed by the newspaper stories, the board of the museum met in secret. There was a unanimous vote to ship the mummy case to a New York museum, which had agreed to accept the gift provided it was handled without publicity and sent by the safest means possible. The case must be shipped by the prestigious new vessel making her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York that month. All arrangements were successfully completed, but the mummy case never reached New York. It was in the cargo hold of the unsinkable Titanic when she carried 1,498 people to their doom on April 15th, 1912. Then there's another little mini segment that says Racing Driver's Spirit. Vincent Herman was the first man to die in a crash at the old Brooklands racetrack near Weybridge, Surrey. Locals say the motoring pioneer still haunts the railway straight where his car overturned in September 1907. Next segment is called A Steer Called Murder. The Old West had its share of ghost stories, but none is stranger than the tale of the steer branded Murder. From 1890 to 1920, cowhands shuddered over the legend. The story began in 1890 in Brewster County, Texas, where the brothers Zach and Gil Spencer were rounding up longhorn cattle. The two had always been close, but tempers frayed in the hectic roundup. Suddenly, there was a dispute between them over a handsome steer with an enormous spread of horns. We could draw straws for him, Gil suggested, or better yet, our guns, Zach roared, whipping his 6-gun out of its holster and shooting his younger brother dead. When his temper abated, Zach was grief-stricken. He sadly lifted his brother's body and placed it tenderly over the back of a horse. A thoughtless cowhand asked how the steer should be branded now. With the same kind of brand that's on my hide, Zach sobbed. Brand him Murder and cut him loose, and I hope to God he haunts the mesa for 1,000 years. He buried his brother that afternoon and then killed himself. A few months later, the branded steer began to appear in wildly separate parts of the countryside. Amazingly, many who had even a passing glimpse of him were fated to kill or be killed. A cowboy saw him and told his two best friends about it. When they accused them of lying, he shot them both. Hours after sighting the maverick steer, a small rancher killed his brother-in-law in a family argument. A runaway boy lost all desire to be a gunman when he met the steer on a lonely trail. In the nearest cow town, he tried to surrender his guns to the marshal. Tragically, the marshal misinterpreted the gesture and shot him down. It was believed that the steer had died and had become a ghost whose restless hooves were taking it across all borders. The physical description had changed too. The steer was now a bull. Lone Allen, a Montana rancher, said in 1920, the brand across him looked big and red and not healed up the way it ought to be, not haired over at all. It looked as raw and cruel in the moonlight as on the day that they burned it into the critter. Allen had been a partner with his friend Cole Farrell in a small spread next to Fay Dow's D Down Ranch. Dow wanted their land, and one night called on Allen when he knew Farrell was in town. He managed to convince Allen that his friend was making love to his girl. Crazed with jealousy, Allen crouched in the midnight ambush with a 6-gun in his hand. At the sound of hoofbeats on the trail, he braced himself to kill. But the one thing that blundered at the moonlight wasn't Cole's, Farrell's horse. It was the bull branded Murder. In a wild panic, Allen sent 4 bullets crashing into the creature's skull. The apparition looked at him sadly and then drifted away. Fay Dow heard the shots and gleefully rushed to the scene. As the plot became evident, there was a shootout in which Allen was wounded and Dow died with 2 bullets in him. In the strange trial that followed, Allen took the stand in his own defense and in the defense of the bull. It was true, he said, that he'd seen the phantom and had killed the man moments later, but his partner was riding towards the ranch, and if it hadn't been for the bull, he would have killed the wrong man. And so the jury took 10 minutes to acquit Allen. The ghostly bull with the scarlet brand faded into history, for no one ever saw him again. Next segment is called The Witch's Mark, Scars on a Persecutor's Grave. The year was 1692 and 13 people had been hanged for witchcraft in Salem, Massachusetts. It was a matter of concern to Colonel Bucks of Bucksport's, Maine, that his own village should be just as vigilant in stamping out witches. He raised the question repeatedly at town hall meetings. Shortly, his one-man crusade produced a victim. This was a public accusation of a bent and withered old lady who looked every inch a witch. Historians disagree as to her name and age, but one of them calls her Comfort Ainsworth and is sure that she was more than 90 years old. Because of her obvious frailty, the old lady went on trial without torture or pricking with needles to find the witch's mark, but the crowds that surged into the courtroom knew her guilt had been predetermined by Colonel Bucks himself, who sat within whispering distance of the magistrate. When witnesses took the stand against her, without exception they looked to Bucks for approval. One woman said she had heard the old woman muttering something that sounded gibberish, but when she reached home and her ears started bleeding, she knew it had been a curse. A man swore he'd seen a black-garbed figure 10 feet tall, obviously the devil or one of his henchmen, standing in Comfort's doorway. The jury quickly returned a verdict of guilty. Quoting the text, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," the judge denounced Comfort Ainsworth and sentenced her to hang the next day. No one was prepared for the scene that followed. Because she had not been permitted to testify in her own defense, people had assumed that the toothless old woman would remain mute. Before the bailiffs could stop her, she got to her feet and pointed a bony finger at the colonel. "In all of my life," she screamed, "I have cursed no other being, but I am capable of laying a curse on you, sir, because you and your toadies have led me to the gallows. Then mark you this, and mark it well. When you go to your grave, which will be soon, I pledge you I shall leave the print of my foot on your gravestone. And the print, Colonel Bucks, will be there forever, so that the world can never forget this day." A bailiff clapped his palm to her mouth and carried her from the courtroom, but her words left the village uneasy, and there were a few spectators when she was hanged the next morning. Even Colonel Bucks failed to appear. 3 months later, he died from a wasting disease, and the colonel's heirs found he had written a new instruction into his will. His headstone must be of the most flawless marble, incapable of being stained or besmirched. But in a few days, the relatives were secretly approached by a terrified cemetery worker. He had found a woman's footprint in the marble, and no amount of sanding could remove it. A new stonecutter was sworn to absolute secrecy. Working in the dead of night, he cut a marker that was an absolute replica of the first. The old stone was buried secretly, and the new one raised. 10 days later, the heirs saw crowds of frightened people moving in and out of the cemetery. Joining them, they found that the trick had failed. The shape of an old woman's narrow, stock-hind foot was clearly visible in the new stone. Publicly deploring the phenomenon as an act of graveyard vandalism, an explanation that convinced no one, the heirs had a still more costly headstone hauled to the cemetery. It was raised with no attempt at secrecy. Incredibly, the print of Comfort's bony little foot soon began to take shape in this new stone. This time, his discouraged heirs made no effort to replace the marker. Nearly 3 centuries later, it stands over the grave of Colonel Bucks, the footprint still scarring its surface like a wound that will never heal. And then there's a little mini segment that's called Gallows Curse. Norfolk Island, a dot in the Pacific Ocean, 900 miles off of the east coast of Australia, was a British penal colony until the last century, and many residents today claim to have seen the specters of convicts hang there. But the strangest mystery is the legend of Barney Duff's curse. The giant Irishman escaped from the colony's jail and was found hiding in a hollow tree by 2 soldiers. Duffy knew he would be executed if returned to the prison. He warned the privates, "If you take me back, you will die violently within a week of my hanging." The 2 men ignored the threat, and Duffy died on the gallows. 2 days later, the soldiers went fishing from a beach near the tree where they had captured him. Next morning, their beaten bodies were washed up by the tide. No one ever discovered who or what had killed them. Next segment is called The Skulls of Calgarth. Wealthy Miles Phillipson owned huge tracts of the picturesque English Lake District countryside around Windermere during the 16th century, but he was never satisfied with the extent of his empire, always restlessly seeking new acres to add to his estates. He eyed the small farm of Craster and Dorothy Cook, which overlooked the lake, and he decided that their humble plot of land would be the ideal site for the new luxurious mansion he planned. The farm was all the Cooks had in the world, and they were not prepared to sell when Phillipson made his offer. He was not a man to take no for an answer. He invited the poor couple to share Christmas dinner with him and his family. The Cooks were awed by the foods and wines and overjoyed when the landowner said they could keep a golden bowl that they admired. Next morning, soldiers hammered at the door of their home and arrested them. For a week, they were held in separate cells with no idea why they were being imprisoned. Only when they arrived in court did they learn of their crime, stealing a golden bowl from Miles Phillipson. The verdict was a foregone conclusion because the magistrate hearing the case was Phillipson himself. When he sentenced them both to death, Dorothy cried out, "Look out for yourself. You will never prosper. The time will come when you own no land. You will never be rid of us." Phillipson was not worried by the threats. The couple were hustled to the gallows and strung up to die. Within days, Phillipson had acquired their land and started work on his magnificent new home called Calgarth Hall. When it was finished, he held a lavish Christmas feast to celebrate. Friends and neighbors joined him round the table, making merry with no expense spared. Then a terrifying scream sent them rushing upstairs, swords at the ready. Phillipson's wife stood halfway up the staircase, shuddering as she stared transfixed at the hideous sight on the banister, 2 grinning skulls. The landowner seized them, threw them in the courtyard, and swore revenge on whoever had perpetrated the tasteless joke. But his threats failed to put the minds of his guests at rest. Several shuffled off to bed early, only to be woken in the small hours by more screams. The skulls were back on the stairs. Over the next few days, Phillipson tried everything he knew to get rid of them, but each time they were thrown outside or buried, the skulls returned back to haunt the home. Christmas was ruined, and as as was the news spread, so was Philipson. His business declined, his riches dwindled. When he died, a broken man, his beautiful home rang all night with the demonic laughter of the skulls. The two gruesome relics continued to visit the hall, giving the landowner's heirs no rest. They appeared each Christmas Day and on the anniversary of the cook's execution. Only when the family became too poor to maintain Calgarth and were forced to sell it did the skulls leave the building in place. Then there's another mini segment called The Restless Skull. Collecting skulls was the private passion of a British doctor, John Kilner. He had them specially polished and encased in ebony boxes, which he displayed around his home. But the skull that fascinated him most of all was one that he did not own. It was on a skeleton at West Suffolk Hospital, where he worked in the 1870s. Part of the attraction was the skeleton's gruesome history. It was the skeleton of a murderer, 23-year-old William Corder, hanged in public at nearby Bury St. Edmunds Prison in April 1828 for the notorious red-bound murder of Maria Martin. For years, Dr. Kilnor greedily eyed the skeleton, which was used to teach students. Then one night he stole it and put it on one of the showcases in his home. Immediately, his life became a nightmare. An evil spirit roamed the house, muttering and breathing heavily. Often sobbing was heard. Eventually, a vivid white hand floated through the air and smashed the skull's showcase. The doctor was so horrified that he gave the skull to a friend who was in turn subjected to so much similar terror that he finally gave it to a Christian burial. The tormented soul of Killer Corder was at last able to rest. And then the next segment is called Possessed, Takeover by the Last Witch. Terry Palmer set out to find the resting place of the last witch in England to be burned at the stake, but his quest took him along an unnerving path, with his own body taken over by the witch he sought. The spirit said she would be with Terry for all time, no matter where he went. England's last witch, whose name was Elsa, was tortured and burned to death on the old village green of Dedham, Essex in 1763. More than 200 years later, Terry set out to find her burial place, but everywhere he went, inexplicable happenings took place. He once visited a former convent where a terrier dog ran out to greet him, barking and wagging its tail. Then it ran back to its master before bounding back right past Terry. It was barking and leaping at an empty space. A few days later in a shop, another dog barked twice at Terry and then twice at the empty space behind him. The extraordinary tale of Terry, a good book publisher, began when he went to a seance on his witch-hunting trail. There, says Terry, Elsa herself took over his body and joined in the ghost hunt. Shortly afterwards, his father became possessed by evil spirits, and a fire broke out in his factory, causing thousands of pounds of damage. Terry claimed to have found Elsa's grave near a hotel not far from the tiny village where she was executed. He stood on the spot and felt a tingling sensation from the back of his head to the middle of his spine, but when he and his friend dug down, they found nothing. Terry's story was told in the hotel and was treated with skepticism until one day when a barman was having lunch while keeping an eye on the empty bar through a mirror. He saw a woman standing in the room and went to serve her, but the bar was empty and all the doors were locked. Next segment, a little one, the mini segment is called The Duke's Grief. York Villa, the building in historic Bath that now houses a buses company's social club, has had several supernatural visitors over the years. A young boy, a lady in gray, and a man in a long cloak have all been seen, and footsteps have been heard walking upstairs. All the ghostly happenings are said to date back to the time when the house was the home of one of the mistresses of Frederick, Duke of York, the son of George III. When he left for London after telling her their affair was over, the mistress decided to follow him, instructing her servants to take care of her two children. But the staff had not been paid for some time and left the house. When one old retainer returned some days later, he found the two children starved to death. The footsteps sadly climbing the stairs are said to be his. And then the last segment is called Skyway to Doom. Has the ghost of an American construction worker put a curse on the Sunshine Skyway Bridge? That was the theory put forward by a Florida fisherman after nearly 60 people died in four separate shipping disasters at the Tampa Bay Bridge during the first 5 months of 1980. In January, 23 Coast Guards were killed when their cutter collided with an oil tanker. The following month, a freighter smashed into one of the main bridge supports, and then 10 days later, a tanker ran out of control and slammed into the main span. But the worst accident to hit the Jinx Bridge came on May 9th. Possibly blinded by the wind-lashed rain of a violent storm, the skipper of a 10,000-ton Liberian freighter called the Summit Venture misjudged his approach to the bridge. Instead of passing under the middle of it, the ship plowed into one of the main supports, and a huge section of the road running over it collapsed. Cars, trucks, and a Greyhound bus plunged 100 feet into the water. 32 people died, 23 of them on the bus. Other drivers missed death by inches, slamming on their brakes just in time as the yawning gap opened up in front of them. The Florida House of Representatives stood for a moment's silence as news of the tragedy reached them during a meeting. One member blamed the Tampa Bay Harbor pilot system and then called for an inquiry. But a local fisherman, 27-year-old Charlie Williams, said later, when the bridge was being built, a construction worker fell into some of the wet concrete. He's still there in the structure. The Skyway has been cursed ever since. The bridge, which is 4 miles long, was opened on September 1954, and more than 40 people have committed suicide by leaping from it. Then that's it. That's all the segments associated with part 2, in this case of chapter 1, the one chapter titled Vengeful, Ghosts, and Curses, again coming from the book called The World's Greatest Ghost by Roger Bohr. So let's go ahead and let's talk about that here. So the first segment was The Mummy's Hand. It was almost like a re-examination of the classic tale, right, as far as having a mummy's hand basically causing a curse on people. Here in this case, it was involved with the new owners who locked it away into an empty safe, but then they were horrified to see that the shriveled hand was now gaining flesh. At least they decided to do the right thing when it came to taking care of the hand and giving it a proper burial, especially since the previous owner of the hand was someone who had died a horrible death and then was apparently being stopped from going into the afterlife, or whatever the version is there from Egypt. So once they did that, it looks like that ghost came back and then the hand disappeared and nothing else happened really afterward, other than the fact that they still had some kind of ill effects in the hospital and something that they tried to stop when it came to their friend opening up that King Tut's burial ground afterward. Princess of Death was an interesting segment. That was I never heard about a cursed item essentially sinking with the Titanic. Here you had a situation where yet another item from Egypt that was cursed was being placed in that ship because of so much tragedy that it in turn was causing. Here you had a scenario where you had this guy named Murray who wanted to have a mummy case. Like it was something that was so wanted by this guy that he basically got it, and then when he did, even with all the warnings associated with it, he still had it, and then it ended up causing so many deaths, including from people he knew and some of the servants as well. And finally, wanting to get rid of it, he put it on the Titanic, and then we all know what happened next afterward. So it's an interesting take when it comes to the curse of the Titanic potentially being tied to that. Most interesting tale that I saw, though, was the one about the steer called Murder. They're apparently happening in Brewster County, Texas. Who knew? Apparently, you could have a steer that one of them that in this case involved the death of two brothers, one being a murder, the other one being a suicide, and it was tied to this steer essentially being coveted by both of them. In other words, because of its high value. Well, the brother decided, the one who killed the other brother, decided to brand him as Murder. That way he could mark himself as the cause, or at least have some association of guilt from the brother because of it. And then once that steer presumably died, the ghost is roaming out there. And then anyone who watches it is essentially cursed as well. I'm wondering if that's still the case. Even though it says no one has ever seen the ghostly bull again, I do wonder if it's still out there somewhere. Then the other segment called The Witch's Mark. That one I've actually talked about before. It was featured on one of my videos. There you had that situation with Salem, Massachusetts, and then somebody being buried or killed, basically, because they were being accused of a witch by that person, Colonel Bucks. And then the idea that that witch was going to curse. If it literally was a witch, they were still going to curse the colonel's grave with her footprint. And then sure enough, that's there. If you haven't seen the video, check it out. You'll see pictures of the actual footprint on the cemetery grave. And then you can be judged for yourself. See if that's truly something 100% real. Then the Skulls of Calgarve was, I believe, something else I talked about as well. I think I called it the Grinning Skulls. There was the idea that there was this landowner who now had a coveted land, but he ended up causing the deaths of the two landowners. And so because of it, they in turn started haunting him with the Screaming Skulls. And then because of it, they caused him to essentially lose all his fortune, become a broken man, and then ended up dying as is. And then they in turn haunted the family afterward. I'll have to double check, but I'll see if that was the case. But otherwise, I wonder where those skulls went afterward too. And then one of the last segments was the Possessed, taken over by the witch. That one was a weird tale. I never really heard of that one. I might not talk about it too much because it seemed like he was the only witness. So if that was the case, then how did they know that anyone else had seen it other than that barman towards the end? Skyway to Doom, though, was interesting. Somebody let me know about that. Sunshine Skyway Bridge, is there a curse there? Anyone there by that location in Tampa Bay? Anyone know more history on it too? If so, please post those comments. I'm wondering if there's local tales there about people seeing ghostly apparitions, all caused by the deaths, caused by the curse from that guy, the guy who ended up, unfortunately, the construction worker falling into that concrete and basically being buried alive. It reminded me of the Luxor's tale as well, about some of the curses associated with the building of that specific building. But let me know what you guys think. This ends chapter 1, again, of the book, The World's Greatest Ghost. And then later on, I'll be starting chapter 2. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care.